Welcome, Chris, to my Doing Business in China expert interviews. And this is actually the first session we do for this series. And it's my great pleasure to welcome you.
Well, it's a real great honor to be here. Thank you so much, Ting.
Yeah, so you have taken the Sinyi Professorship of Chinese Management at the Cambridge Judge Business School since earlier this year. And you've relocated from the US. One of your expertise areas is on entrepreneurship and market development in China. Could you tell us a bit more about your research and indeed your new book?
Sure. Well, yeah, first, again, really appreciate the opportunity to talk about these items. I'm new to the UK. So as you mentioned, I relocated in January. Before I'm American, as people can probably tell from the way I speak, and I relocated from New York City. It's been great to be in Cambridge so far, and a real honor to have this professorship. I have a new book, as you mentioned, that's just coming out called Mao and Markets, The Communist Roots of Chinese Enterprise. And in this book, we try to examine actually how China's economy, which really mixes, sort of in some ways, very developed markets with also very active government and state control, how that actually has played out over the past 30 years, not just as an academic exercise, but also then how to help businesses understand how to compete there as well.
I can see that book is behind on the shelf.
Yes, exactly right. A little advertisement.
So when is coming out?
So it actually, in the UK, it comes out January 10th, and in the US, November 15th. So actually, I just got my copies very recently.
Great. We'll look out for that. So China's economy is slowing down, and many argue that it might be hard for China to hit its regional target, 5.5 for 2022. On the other hand, some China observers say that the latest Chinese government has been chosen for its loyalty over experience. Do you think that economic growth is no longer priority for the Chinese government?
Yeah, that's a tough question. I think that there's a lot of speculation about this, and certainly probably as you saw and many of your sort of watchers saw, after the new standing committee was announced, the markets really came down quite a bit, not just stock markets but currency markets, indicating that actually investors are not as optimistic. And I think I sort of share their pessimism, unfortunately. I think that over the past few years, obviously there's been sort of the COVID zero policy, which it seems actually that's going to be continuing at least into the probably new year. I think that many of the crackdowns on different businesses, common prosperity program, I think all of these things really, I guess, suggest to observers that in some ways, sort of ideology and security, national security, is a priority over economic growth. That being said, if you talk to entrepreneurs or businesses in China, many of them are still optimistic. I mean, these are multinationals I'm talking about. If you look at surveys from the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, for instance, a lot of businesses are still optimistic. I think, China is a gigantic market, 1.4 billion people, as is often said. And so, even though maybe the general trend may be downward, there's still tons of opportunities.
So compared to 10 years ago, do you think China as a whole is becoming more open to the West, or is it the other way around?
Yeah, this is another sort of, I'm sorry to be such a downer on your program. I mean, I think it's really hard to say. I mean, because COVID obviously has really limited travel, not just to and from China, but even, to other, around the world. So I do think that over the past few years, there had, without actually the people-to-people contact, that's actually created a lot of spillover issues. There's a lot more tension these days between China and a number of Western countries, the US and the UK being the ones that I know the most. And I think part of that reason is that people just aren't able to go back and forth. And, and it's easy for the media, maybe media or politicians say things more for domestic consumption, and that gets misinterpreted. And I think, so I think that actually, unfortunately, things are not as open. My experience as an educator has definitely found that over the past few years, there's been, a little bit more of a closing of, of the university atmosphere. This is being, so I've experienced that myself, but then also you see these things like, canceling English language tests, sort of withdrawing from international, ranking systems, and other things that really, that do unfortunately suggest that China is a little bit more protective of its borders, so to speak, than it was maybe 5-10 years ago.
Yes, in terms of how the sort of general atmosphere is seen to be. But on the other hand, if you see this week, China is doing this main import exhibition, CIIE,
right?
And there are lots of deals being signed, and apparently the government is also highly sort of advocating that China is open to the world for importing, certainly. So perhaps it's not that the sort of whole market, but certainly for import. Do you think that is still going to be very well received?
I think definitely, and particularly, I mean, I think sort of high tech and other, advanced type of, sort of equipment or technologies, that I think there will always be a market for those, both I think because, in general, I think, definitely China wants its industry to keep growing, but also, there is an interest in continuing to learn from other countries if there's some other more advanced, sort of ideas like, the dual circulation strategy, which, there's, sort of one type of circulation is domestic and it's about domestic production and consumption. But then another circulation is actually, the global circulation. And that's very much, I think, about, bringing in, advanced products and other forms of expertise to continue growing this economy.
And of course, we all hope that this travel restriction somehow will be eased in the coming months, with the news about the Schultz's visit to China from the German chancellor, and that seems to be positive.
Yeah, no, I think that's potentially positive. I think I know there's I think it was indication that there's going to be use of the BioNTech vaccine, which I think is very positive. So let's hope that is the beginning of a new era in sort of engagement and interaction between the West and China.
And as you said, the people-to-people sort of dialogue and the face-to-face contact is really important. And Chinese traditional culture, such as guanxi, has been influencing business practice in China. But with the generation Y and Z, mainly the people in their late 20s, now up to the 40s, are becoming more senior management of most Chinese companies, whether they are state-owned or private. And many of them speak English friendly. Do you still think that Chinese culture play as an important role as before in doing business in China?
I think so. I mean, this could be, my background is as a sociologist, and I mean, that's my, even though I teach at a business school, that's my academic training. And so things like, culture, networks, social engagement, these are the things that really sort of stand out to me as an observer. And I think, even though, certainly many Chinese executives do speak English, and that really, I think, makes communication a lot easier, but that doesn't mean that actually the cultural norms are different. And so, many times when I went to China before COVID, just the culture of, sort of doing business around a dinner table and having, sort of, baijiu, toasting other people. I mean, this doesn't really, as far as I know, exist in the West. And so, I mean, that's actually something that's easy to learn because, I mean, you can do it, but sort of what that means as far as actually, establishing trust and sort of personal relations with the people that you're going to be working with. Yeah, I think in the West, I think has actually even gotten more, sort of even less socially embedded work relationships. And so I do think that there is still, a gap in culture. So it's something really, even if the person you're working with does speak English, I think if you're trying to do business in China, I think you have to really keep in the top of your mind that, culturally it's a different context and country.
And also, even as you said, the language is not such a barrier sometimes, but it's a cultural nuances many of the times
Right.
not easy to be picked up by the Westerns unless they have lived and worked in China extensively. And so it's always useful. I find that when talking with our clients and generally Western business people, that it's worthwhile to actually understand the Chinese culture and particularly how Chinese think differently and then the behave also differently in the context of doing business as well.
Yes, right.
So if we come back to talk about the Chinese economy, in President Xi's report at the last week's party congress, they specifically mentioned that it's important to support the private sector. And of course, this has been said for a while. Do you see that there will be a real improvement to this? And are there any implications for Western businesses as well?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think, I mean, it was certainly, I think, good to see, President Xi mention that in his report. I think that really the private sector is so important to China and its future because, that is where innovation, novelty, creativity can come because, the state-owned enterprises, I mean, they have amazing sort of scale and size, but also very bureaucratic and so not very innovative. And so I think that, the private companies, which you've seen over the past decades, companies like Alibaba and Tencent and ByteDance that have been tremendously innovative. I mean, Huawei as well. And but if you look at the last few years, it does seem that there is increasing interest from the state in having control. So I know there's been some instances in some of those companies I just mentioned where, the government, it might actually be the party, I'm not even sure if it's the government, actually has in some ways required sale of a certain amount of stock to one of these entities, either the party or the government. Again, I can't remember. And then actually those shares have some special rights where maybe they can put someone on the board, or there's some sort of veto power over certain decisions. There's been expansion of party branches within private enterprises. So I do think while it's really good to hear that from President Xi, my sense is sort of the ideology of the government is not about grassroots innovation, but it's about having mechanisms of top-down control. And and they may give money, but you can see, many of the funds that they gave, for instance, for semiconductors, the big fund, a lot of that money went to waste, and people were prosecuted for corruption. So I think that the top-down logic, it does not help private enterprise. I think private enterprise, to be truly an engine of growth and innovation, has to have to be let free. And I don't, I don't see sort of the controls lessening on private business.
Do you see a difference between the bigger private companies, such as, you mentioned Tencent, Alibaba? Of course, we have seen that even Fusion recently
Right.
is in trouble, and after
Right.
HNA and
Right.
Wanda, etc. But then there are also millions smaller
Yes.
Chinese companies, but they don't make headlines. Do you think they benefit somehow from this?
Yeah, I'm really glad you asked that, because I do think in the West, I mean, we have these famous companies are sort of easy to see, but I think the recent statistics I saw that there's like 25 million businesses in China, and 15 million entrepreneurs. So some entrepreneurs own multiple businesses. So this, goes way beyond sort of Jack Ma, Pony Ma, Ren Zhengfei. I mean, this is, truly an amazing example of entrepreneurship. And perhaps, I mean, I did for the book. We interviewed over 30. A lot of the data in the book is actually, we have these, a variety of historical data and databases, but also we do interviews. We did interviews with over 30 entrepreneurs. Most of this interviews were done, before 2021. And I think that, they were optimistic about their prospects. And so, maybe for those entrepreneurs that haven't sort of reached the scale and they're so visible, I know, you probably know this who run rich list that exists, and people always would say, that's, if you like get to be top on that list, that's the kiss of death, and people get in trouble. So actually interestingly, talking about the Chinese dinners, I mean, one night I was at a dinner, and it was with some university people and some famous alumni from that university, and one of the people had actually donated 1 million renminbi to the university, which actually that's kind of, the universities in China are state owned. They actually don't get that much, or state, sort of state funded. And he said, I don't want to be that wealthy, to be honest, because, if I'm really wealthy, it's just like having a target on my back. And so I think, your idea of separating out, actually these really big targets, where there may be a lot more control. Yeah, maybe there is a lot more, sort of vibrancy and support for, the tens of millions of other entrepreneurs in China.
Indeed, I think these are also the smaller companies are those that really needed help
Right.
from the government, particularly when it comes to financing. We know that Chinese banks are not known to be easy to, when it comes to lend to the smaller businesses. But from also our experience working with many Western smaller clients and their counterparts, sometimes we would advise them also to consider smaller Chinese companies that match almost their size sometimes, because they're easier to deal with than those huge Chinese big private companies, which themselves can be very bureaucratic themselves.
Yeah, that definitely makes a lot of sense.
So if we now sort of turn to another perspective, as you're coming from the US as well, and in the US and the UK, it's much more harder for Chinese companies to invest into tech. With that context, do you see there's more Chinese greenfield investment coming into these countries, and do you see government support in that?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I think there's probably a lot of opportunity, outside of sort of sensitive, so to speak, industries, and these are, I think mainly tech these days. I mean, I think travel restrictions will need to ease, because it's really hard to actually sort of own and manage a company from afar if you can't actually, have back and forth between the managers. But so I do, I see some potential, as long as it's beyond sort of, sort of not necessarily in, sensitive industries. And I do think, though, greenfield. So I'm hearing that as like, actually from the grounds up starting a company. I mean, I think acquisitions is something that is, a sort of easier way. I mean, there potentially more scrutiny from the governments, but that, you get an operation that is already sort of up and running. Yeah, that's
But in terms of setting up their own R&D centers,
right.
Yeah, do you think that maybe something different?
I think that is a good idea because, many Chinese companies that I've observed when they go overseas, I mean, a lot of times they're staffed by, a lot of Chinese. They bring over actually staff, sort of over with them. And I think that, ways of really engaging with the local populace, engaging with the government, is by trying to sort of develop and foster human capital, which is what, you would do in an R&D center. And, in the UK, maybe, I mean, of course, maybe bring over some sort of scientists and researchers from China, but also, hire many of the great science graduates and technology graduates we have here in the UK. And I think this is a way, both the company learns is through these informal means, gets to learn more about sort of the culture and environment. They also, can get a better relation with the governments as well, because actually those kind of investments, go over very well. I know this was something when Microsoft, in I guess in the 1980s or 90s possibly, was really trying to enter China, actually being very active in, R&D centers and supporting, research of the Chinese population was something that really went over well. And I think even, I don't know if it was Jiang Zemin or Hu Jintao, one of them even visited Bill Gates's home because of the depth of the, relationship that Microsoft had built in China, which is partially through these R&D centers. So I think that as Chinese companies think about going global, that's really a way to do it.
That's encouraging to see that. I know that there's an automotive company called Chang'an Automotive.
Of course, yeah.
They have set up R&D center in Nottingham years ago. I was expecting to see more Chinese companies set up R&D center, and it has not happened yet. So perhaps this would change in the coming years. We will see.
Yeah, I think, the Chinese, I mean, one, I think around in this area, very positive aspect of, in some ways, the Chinese system is that, I mean, the government can encourage, companies to do this. Like, for instance, the Belt and Road, they encourage companies to go global. I think, the government is really focused on sort of soft, at least in the past, has focused on soft power issues globally and reputation issues globally. And this is an important way to actually embed yourself within different countries. And so I do think it's a smart strategy for companies in themselves, but then also for China, the country overall.
And of course, China has to find a way to deal with the new US ban on the tech and talent.
Yeah.
So talk about that. I wanted,
sure.
Interesting to know your perspective, freshly from US, and compare. Do you see the differences or commonalities in the UK and US in its relations or engagement with China?
Yeah, I see, like you said, I mean, I'm, spent most of my time in the US, so I'm most familiar with sort of the US policy. And I always, because it took such a sort of sharp turn after President Trump was elected, when I came over here, one of the reasons actually I came to the Cambridge, there's many reasons. This wasn't a big one, but I'm like, okay, the work I do in China, actually, the UK might be a better perch to do that, because I assumed there would be much less contention. Well, after Boris Johnson stepped down, and there's a lot of discussion between Truss and Sunak about China. It seemed like they were trying to one up each other with who could be more negative on China. And so it does seem that there is both countries have, I mean, there's tensions there. I think, the US to my mind, maybe the tensions have been going on a little, sort of a little bit longer. And, policy wise, as a result of that, maybe have developed further. So I think the US CHIPS Act, there's the Uyghur Forced Labor Production Act. There's Biden's executive order around personnel working in the semiconductor industry. So if you're a US passport or green card holder, you're unable to work for, companies that actually are sort of on products that are banned from China. So, even like, so the ASML, the cutting edge, sort of chip machine company in the Netherlands, even, when that order came out, they actually put on hold a bunch of work for some of their American employees. So that gives you a sense of just how widespread that act or that action by Biden has. So I think particularly around tech, there will continue to be a lot, ongoing tensions, because I think that both the US and the UK are concerned about the trajectory of China. And I don't think this is a concern necessarily, to be honest, about like, oh, China's growing economically, let's, hold China back. I really don't think that's it. I think that, the leadership of President Xi, I think, is a concern. And I think that's where the concern is coming from, not so China's growth.
Mm. So we I mean, we are going through very interesting times.
Yes.
And just the weekend, I know I caught up, news on German Chancellor's visit to China.
Right.
And then I saw also some media, particularly in actually in Hong Kong and Taiwan, they see this as a quite important visit. And,
Yes.
and some media call it almost ice-breaking, in that aspect that Germany seemed to decide to go on its own to engage
Right.
China more, in a more positive or constructive
Right.
way.
Yes.
So do you see that is going to affect perhaps the policy making in the UK? Probably not US.
Yeah, maybe. I'm not sure how that influence potentially goes, but I do. One of the things I really appreciate, and probably this was published elsewhere, but where I saw it was Politico, the U.S. I guess politics sort of website, an online publication, where the German chancellor actually published something and said, it is essential to engage China. I mean, this idea of decoupling, I mean, is, does no one any benefit. And I actually, I do actually really support that, because I do think that for the sake of the world, the sake of, I mean, there's all kinds of, reasons to continue to collaborate. And climate change, I think, the US and China, really, it's super important to be able to work together. I think, though, that, so as I think about things, where I I do hope and encourage a lot of engagement, but also in a way that I think is a level playing field and fair. So I think that issues around sort of reciprocity of sort of regulations and entering markets. I think if China is restricting Facebook and Google and Twitter, I think if the US is asking about restricting TikTok, I think that's a reasonable thing. I think that, China has a lot of restrictions on who and what can enter its market. And then there's these big blowups and they say, oh, America, you're so horrible for having this restriction. Well, they actually are China is much more restrictive of the US products entering. So I think that, reciprocity is a very important sort of bedrock principle. And I think, making sure reciprocity exists and then engaging after that.
I think you're absolutely right on that. Because people have always expected the US to be open or UK
Right.
to be open, and they already know that China is never totally open.
Right.
And therefore, it's almost like come a surprise when when
Right.
the US is becoming less open. So it's like backwards rather than forward. So I guess the pressure is on also for China to further open, which is what
Right.
the government is saying. But in practice, we got to see actually this it's actually happening rather than just sort of just the policy.
Right.
So what do you think for 2022? Do you foresee any interesting business trends that business should be think about?
No, I mean, I do really hope. So the key thing for me is to think about, I mean, I hope in 2023 that, that we're able to, China's able to, open, and we're able to restore, frequent person to person interaction between the two countries, because I really do think that's so important. And I think that, you know, business and those kind of interactions is really important glue, that even if there is tension in the political realm, the business interaction and the people interaction is what's going to really sort of hold the two countries together, which I think, is really important.
Yes, and I'm certainly looking forward to making the first trip since COVID. And I believe you also got a teaching trip to go to, right?
Yeah. So I'm teaching at the Schwartzman College at Tsinghua in April, and so I don't know if I'm gonna, I don't know what the process is, because there has to be a visa and all kinds of things. And I think that they were thinking that after the 20th Party Congress, that it would be a little bit clear when the opening would be, so all those steps could be taken. So I'm actually not sure of what's going to happen with that.
So when it comes to actually taking advantage of any opportunities that will come next year, if China finally opens its travel again, we still need to actually understand how Chinese business work. So in that context, I think your book is very interesting. And can you just also remind us how it's relevant for companies doing business in China now?
Sure. Yeah. So I think that I mean, there's a cultural piece that you mentioned, which we really sort of dig into, traditional Chinese culture, and as it's being applied in modern China. But then also, yeah, the nuances of how the state and the party intersect with business, which is obviously very important for, companies that are existing there, but then also companies that are interested in going in the future. And I think, one of the things that's so important to remember about China is that, even though it is a, country that has a, strong central government, there is actually tremendous diversity across regions, provinces, cities, and part of our book is about that variation, and how, sort of understanding, maybe, leaders and culture in different regions actually can provide some business opportunities.
That's actually a very good point, because China is so big and culturally it's very different.
Right.
And doing business in China in the north, as we talk about, drinking Malta, etc., is much that is much more stronger the tradition than if you go to some of the southern province like Guangdong probably or Shanghai. Yeah. Thank you again, and hopefully we can talk about this again early next year.
Yeah, no, I agree. No, thanks so much for having me, Ting. It was great to chat with these topics of both of our interests. And again, look forward to seeing you as well in the new year.